His German shepherd refused to stop digging under the lightning-scarred oak until the former Navy diver uncovered a secret that had been buried in the mud for 7 decades. The rain turned the forest floor into a thick, black slurry as Elias Thorne stood on the edge of a property that every local in Grey Ridge called the Dead Plot. He had exactly $12 in his pocket, a rusted toolbox, and a loyal German shepherd named Ace, who hadn't stopped pacing since they crossed the property line. They laughed at the auction when Elias bid $500 for the 20 acres of rocky vertical timberland that no developer would touch. But beneath the roots of a tree that had seen 100 storms, hidden from the world since 1945, waited a steel latch that would drag Elias back into the world he tried to forget and give him a reason to stop running. Comment 1 or 0 and tell us where you're watching from today. The bus stop in Grey Ridge smelled like damp pine wood smoke and old grease. Elias Thorne stepped off the Greyhound with the stiff, measured movements of a man whose body had been pushed to the breaking point too many times. In his right hand, he gripped the worn handle of a military-grade duffel bag. His left hand rested firmly on the harness of Ace, a German shepherd whose coat was beginning to silver around the muzzle. Ace didn't move like a normal dog. He moved like a scout, his ears constantly swiveling, his dark eyes scanning the perimeter of the gravel lot. Before Elias even took a step, the November wind cut through Elias's thin jacket, carrying the sharp scent of the Ozark winter. Elias paused, looking at the town. Grey Ridge was a place where time seemed to have stalled. A single hardware store with a flickering neon sign, a diner with fogged-up windows, and a courthouse that looked like it was held together by nothing but habit and ivy. This was a place for people who wanted to be forgotten. That suited Elias just fine. Ace gave a low, sharp huff, leaning his weight against Elias's leg. "I know, boy," Elias muttered. "It's not the ocean, but it's quiet." Elias Thorne was 48 years old, but his eyes looked like they belonged to a man of 80. As a Navy diver, he had spent his life in the crushing dark of the deep sea, repairing what was broken and recovering what was lost. But the bends hadn't been what broke him. It was a recovery mission in the North Atlantic 3 years ago, a mission where the pressure became too much, the equipment failed, and Elias had to choose who came up and who stayed down. He had come home with a medical discharge, a pension that barely covered a motel room, and a silence in his head that only Ace could fill. Ace was a retired search and rescue dog, a washout from the K-9 program because he was considered too empathetic. In the military, they wanted killers or tools. Ace was a partner. He had been with Elias through the nightmares, the shelters, and the long nights in the back of a broken-down truck. Elias started walking. The Dead Plot was 5 miles outside of town, up a winding service road that the locals avoided. As they walked, the sound of the town faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel and the sighing of the wind through the pines. Elias's mind drifted back to the auction. The land was an old estate forfeit, labeled unusable due to the steep terrain and a history of lightning strikes that had left half the timber charred and useless. The Dead Plot, the auctioneer had called it. Nobody wanted land that wouldn't grow crops and couldn't hold a foundation, but when Elias looked at the topographical map, he saw something others didn't. He saw a place where a man could disappear. They reached the property line as the sun began to dip behind the ridges, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The woods were dense, a wall of cedar and oak that seemed to swallow the light. Ace stopped at the rusted gate, his hackles rising. He didn't bark. He just stood rigid, his nose twitching. "What is it?" Elias asked, his voice low. Ace looked at Elias, then turned his gaze toward a massive oak tree standing in the center of a small clearing about 50 yards in. The tree had been split by lightning years ago, its trunk a blackened spire that looked like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. They set up camp in the dark. Elias didn't have a tent, just a heavy-duty tarp and a thermal sleeping bag. He built a small fire, the orange flames casting long, dancing shadows against the trees. Ace didn't lie down like he usually did. He paced the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the base of that charred oak. Every few minutes, the dog would let out a low, guttural rumble. "It's just squirrels, Ace," Elias said, though he didn't believe it. The woods were too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the wind. That night, the dreams came back. The cold, black water of the Atlantic. The sound of a sonar ping echoing in his skull. The feeling of being crushed by miles of ocean. Elias woke up gasping, his skin slick with cold sweat. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing red embers. He looked for Ace. The dog wasn't beside him. He found Ace at the base of the lightning-scarred tree. The dog was digging. Not the frantic digging of a dog chasing a rabbit, but a methodical, focused excavation. His paws threw dirt back in rhythmic bursts. "Ace, knock it off," Elias called out, his voice raspy. Ace didn't stop. He ignored the command, something he never did. He was shoulder deep in a hole he'd created between two massive, protruding roots. Elias grabbed his flashlight and walked over. The beam of light hit the dirt, revealing the pale, white roots of the oak. But as Ace threw another pile of earth back, something caught the light, a flash of dull gray metal. Elias knelt down, his heart beginning to pace. He pushed Ace aside gently. "Let me see." He reached into the hole, his fingers brushing against something cold and hard. He cleared away the loose soil, his breath hitching in his chest. It wasn't a rock. It was a plate of heavy-gauge steel, bolted into a frame that seemed to disappear deep into the earth. In the center of the plate was a recessed handle, a heavy steel latch, coated in decades of grease and rust, but unmistakable. Elias stared at it. This wasn't a cellar, and it wasn't a time capsule. The steel was industrial, the kind of reinforced plating Elias had seen on the hulls of old destroyers. Ace sat back, his amber eyes watching Elias with a strange, expectant intensity. It was as if the dog had been looking for this since they stepped off the bus. Rain began to fall again, a cold, steady drizzle that turned the dirt to mud. Elias gripped the handle. He braced his boots against the roots of the tree and pulled. Nothing. The latch was frozen by time. He went to his duffel bag and pulled out a can of industrial lubricant and a heavy pry bar, tools of a trade he thought he'd left behind. He sprayed the hinges, the sharp scent of the oil, cutting through the smell of damp earth. "One more time," he whispered to the dog. He threw his weight into the pry bar. The metal groaned, a high-pitched shriek of protesting steel that echoed through the silent woods. Slowly, inch by inch, the latch turned. With a final, violent heave, the hatch swung upward. A rush of air escaped from the dark opening, air that smelled of oil, old wool, and something metallic. It was the smell of a Navy locker, the smell of the deep. Elias shone his flashlight down into the hole. A set of steel rungs led straight down into a concrete shaft. "Stay here, Ace," Elias commanded. This time the dog obeyed, sitting at the edge of the hole like a sentry. Elias climbed down. The rungs were solid, despite the age. 10 feet down, the shaft opened into a room that was roughly 12 by 12. The walls were thick concrete, reinforced with steel beams. His flashlight swept the room. It wasn't a bunker for a family, it was a supply cache. Along the far wall stood 4 heavy wooden crates, their lids sealed with lead wire. In the corner sat a desk, with an old rotary phone and a stack of logbooks. But it was what was in the center of the room that made Elias stop breathing. A heavy cast-iron naval safe, the kind used on battleships during World War II to protect sensitive documents and payroll. Elias approached the safe. On the door, embossed in the metal, was a serial number and a faded naval insignia. But beneath that, someone had scratched a name into the paint with a knife. V. Thorn. Elias felt the world tilt Thorn. His grandfather, Victor Thorn, had been a legendary naval officer who had disappeared shortly after the war ended. The family story was that he'd walked out on his wife and son, taking his secrets with him. Elias's father had died, hating the man. Elias reached out his hand, trembling as he touched the cold metal of the safe. Suddenly, Ace barked above him, a sharp warning yelp. Elias froze. He heard it then. The sound of a heavy engine crawling up the service road. Headlights swept through the trees above, casting long, moving shadows across the opening of the hatch. He scrambled back up the rungs, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached the top and stayed low, his hand on Ace's collar. A black pickup truck had stopped at the gate of his property. Two men got out, their silhouettes framed by the high beams. They were carrying heavy-duty flashlights and something long and thin rifles. "You sure this is the place, Silas?" a voice called out, gravelly and low. "I told you. The old man's logs," said the Thorn plot. "If the grandson is here, he's already found it. We can't let him leave Grey Ridge with what's in that hole." Elias pulled Ace back into the shadows behind the oak tree. The dead plot wasn't just a piece of useless land. It was a graveyard of secrets, and it seemed the locals had been waiting for a Thorn to return and open the door. Elias Thorn felt the old, familiar coldness settle over him, the dive calm. When you're 200 feet down and your oxygen line kinks, you don't panic. You calculate. He looked at Ace. The dog was low to the ground, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. The two men were moving toward the clearing. They weren't hiding. They moved with the confidence of men who owned the woods. Silas, the taller one, kicked at a pile of brush. "He's here somewhere." "The dog, too," Sheriff said. "He saw him at the diner." The sheriff? The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. This wasn't just a couple of local thugs, this was the town. Elias looked back at the open hatch. If he closed it now, the sound would give him away. If he left it open, they'd find it in minutes. He looked at his duffel bag near the fire. His phone was in there. Not that it mattered. There was no signal out here. He whispered to Ace, "Go! Quiet!" He pointed toward the dense thicket of cedar trees to the north. Ace hesitated, looking at Elias, then melted into the darkness without a sound. Elias didn't run. He moved toward the supply rungs. He didn't go back down. He grabbed a heavy branch from the fire, a thick piece of charred oak that was still smoldering, and retreated into the hollowed-out remains of the split tree. "Over here! The hatch is open!" Silas shouted. The two men sprinted to the base of the oak. Silas shone his light down into the darkness. "I'll be damned." The old man was right. "It's still here. Where's the Thorn kid?" the other one asked, his voice shaking. "Doesn't matter. He's probably hiding in the brush. Get down there and see if the safe is still sealed. If it is, we'll call the truck up to winch it out." The smaller man, a nervous-looking guy in a hunter's orange vest, climbed into the shaft. Silas stood at the top, his rifle held loosely at his side, looking around the clearing. "Come out, Thorn," Silas yelled. "We know you're here. Make this easy. This land hasn't belonged to your family in 50 years. You're trespassing on town property now." Elias watched from the shadows of the blackened trunk. He was less than 10 feet from Silas. He could see the man's pulse jumping in his neck. From the woods to the north, a low, haunting howl echoed through the trees. Silas spun around, raising his rifle. Stupid dog. That second of distraction was all Elias needed. He stepped out of the tree and swung the heavy charred branch with everything he had. The wood connected with the back of Silas's knees. The man buckled with a grunt of pain. Elias didn't wait. He drove his shoulder into Silas's chest, sending the man tumbling backward. Silas didn't fall into the woods. He fell straight into the hatch. A heavy thud, followed by a scream of pain, echoed from the concrete shaft. Elias slammed the steel hatch shut. He grabbed the pry bar and jammed it through the locking handle, wedging it against the concrete frame. He stood there, chest heaving, as muffled shouting and pounding started from beneath his feet. "Ace!" Elias whistled. A low, two-note signal. The German Shepherd emerged from the brush a moment later, his tail low but his eyes alert. "We have to go," Elias said. He grabbed his duffel bag, but he didn't head for the road. He knew they'd have someone watching the entrance. He looked at the terrain. To the east, the property dropped off into a steep ravine that led toward the river. It was the unusable part of the land. For a Navy diver, water wasn't an obstacle. It was an exit. They moved through the dark, Ace leading the way. The dog's nose was better than any flashlight. They navigated the steep, rocky slope, Elias's boots sliding on the damp moss. As they reached the bottom of the ravine, the sound of the river grew into a dull roar. The White River was high from the autumn rains, a churning ribbon of cold gray water. Elias stopped. He looked back up the ridge. He could see the faint glow of flashlights moving near the oak tree, more of them. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, waterproof GPS unit, one of the few things he'd kept from his service. He marked the coordinates of the hatch. "Ace, we're going for a swim." Elias stripped off his heavy boots and tied them to his bag. He checked Ace's harness. "Ready?" The dog looked at the water, then at Elias. He stepped into the current without hesitation. The water was bone-chillingly cold, the kind of cold that steals your breath and numbs your heart. Elias gripped Ace's harness with one hand and swam with the other, letting the current take them. They floated for what felt like miles, the dark trees blurring past. Elias focused on his breathing. In for 4, out for 4, the dive calm. Finally, the river slowed as it hit a wide bend. Elias steered them toward a muddy bank lined with sycamores. They dragged themselves out of the water, shivering uncontrollably. Elias found a small overhang of rock and huddled there with Ace, the dog's body, heat. The only thing keeping the hypothermia at bay. As the sun began to rise, Elias opened his duffel bag. He pulled out a small leather-bound book he grabbed from the desk in the bunker before the men arrived. It was a Navy logbook. He flipped to the last page. The handwriting was his grandfather's. The 12th of December, 1945. The cargo is secure. The town thinks it's gold. Let them believe it. As long as they are looking for money, they won't look for the truth. The Thorn name will carry the burden. To my son, or my grandson, if you find this, the key is not in the safe. The key is the dog. Elias looked at Ace. The dog was watching him, his head tilted. He reached out and felt the underside of Ace's heavy leather harness. He'd bought the harness at a military surplus store months ago, but Ace had come with it. There, sewn into the lining, was a small, hard lump. He sliced the thread with his pocket knife. A small, tarnished brass key fell into his palm. Elias sat back against the rock, the morning sun finally breaking over the ridges. The dead plot wasn't about money. It was about a Navy secret that had stayed buried for 70 years, and Ace wasn't just a partner. He was the guardian of the final piece of the puzzle. Elias Thorn spent the next 2 days moving like a ghost. He knew Grey Ridge was a trap, so he didn't go back to the town. Instead, he used the river. He found an old fisherman's shack 5 miles downstream, abandoned for the season. Inside, he found a rusted stove, some tins of beans, and a dry wool blanket. He spent those 48 hours studying the logbook. Tent. It wasn't just a record of supplies. It was a confession. His grandfather, Victor Thorn, hadn't been a thief or a deserter. He had been a whistleblower. Voyage! In 1945, he had discovered a massive fraud within the Naval Procurement Office. Officers selling off advanced sonar technology to foreign interest before the war was even over. When he tried to report it, he realized the rot went all the way to the top. He had stolen the evidence, the original blueprints and the ledger of the men involved, and hidden it in the one place he knew they wouldn't look. A worthless plot of land in Arkansas protected by a legend of a curse. The money the locals were looking for was a myth. Victor had started to keep them distracted. "They're not looking for gold, Ace," Elias whispered as he rubbed the dog's dry ears. "They're looking for a way to stay out of prison." Or their grandfathers were. The names in the logbook were familiar. Pike, Miller, Bennett, the same families that ran Gray Ridge today. Elias knew he couldn't just walk away. If he left, they'd eventually get into that safe. They'd burn the evidence, and Victor Thorne's name would stay buried in the mud forever. He looked at the brass key. "We're going back." The third night was pitch black, a thick fog rolling off the river. Elias and Ace moved through the woods with the silence of predators. They didn't take the road. They climbed the ravine, using the same vertical path Elias had used to escape. When they reached the clearing, the black pickup truck was still there. A portable generator hummed nearby, powering a set of work lights aimed at the open hatch. 3 men were sitting around a folding table. Silas was there, his leg heavily bandaged, leaning on a crutch. Beside him was a man in a tan uniform. The sheriff. "We're going to have to blast it," the sheriff was saying, his voice tight. "The latch is jammed from the inside. Whatever that Thorne kid did, he locked it tight. He used dynamite. You might destroy whatever's in the safe," Silas argued. Elias watched from the shadows. He had a plan, but it was a diver's plan. It required precision and a lot of luck. He reached into his duffel bag. He had spent the afternoon at a local construction site he'd scouted near the highway. He borrowed a few items, a canister of industrial-grade smoke pellets, used for testing ventilation, and a heavy-duty flare gun. He signaled Ace to stay. Elias circled the clearing until he was upwind of the generator. He cracked the smoke pellets and threw them. Within seconds, a thick, acrid white cloud began to roll across the clearing. "What the hell? The generator's blowing," Silas shouted. The men scrambled, coughing and swearing. In the confusion, Elias moved. He didn't go for the men. He went for the truck. He reached into the cab and grabbed the heavy-duty winch remote. He sprinted to the hatch. "Thorne!" Silas screamed, spotting a shadow through the smoke. Elias fired the flare gun, not at the men, but at the dry brush piles they'd cleared near the truck. A wall of bright red flame erupted, creating a blinding barrier. He reached the hatch. The pry bar was still wedged there. He ripped it out and swung the door open. The man inside, the orange-vested hunter, scrambled out, half blinded by the smoke. Elias ignored him and dropped down the rungs. He reached the safe. He slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, oily click. Inside wasn't gold. It was a thick, leather-bound satchel and a heavy, copper cylinder. He grabbed them and headed for the rungs. As his head cleared the hatch, a heavy boot slammed into his shoulder. Elias fell back, his head hitting the concrete wall of the shaft. Stars exploded in his vision. He felt a hand grab his collar and drag him upward. He was thrown onto the dirt. Silas stood over him, his face twisted in rage, the rifle aimed at Elias's chest. "Give it to me," Silas hissed. The sheriff stepped out of the smoke, his face pale. "Silas, put the gun down. We just want the satchel." "He killed my grandfather's legacy," Silas screamed. "The Thornes have been looking down on us for 70 years. "The legacy was a lie, Silas," Elias rasped, clutching the satchel to his chest. "Your grandfathers weren't pioneers. They were traitors." Silas pulled the bolt back on the rifle. In that moment, a gray and black blur launched itself from the darkness. Ace didn't bark. He was a silent shadow. He hit Silas's shoulder with the force of a battering ram. The rifle went off, the shot echoing like a cannon blast through the trees, but the barrel was jerked upward. The bullet whistled into the night sky. Silas went down. Ace's jaws clamped onto his jacket sleeve, shaking him with a primal fury. The sheriff reached for his sidearm, but Elias was already moving. He swung the copper cylinder, a heavy, solid piece of metal, into the sheriff's wrist. The handgun clattered to the ground. "Enough!" Elias roared. The authority in his voice, the voice of a commander who had seen death at the bottom of the ocean, stopped everyone. Ace stood over Silas, a low growl vibrating through his entire body. Silas lay still, his eyes wide with terror. Elias stood up, blood trickling down his forehead. He held the satchel high. "This is going to the federal authorities in Little Rock," Elias said, his voice cold. "I've already sent the coordinates and the logbook entries via a timed upload from the library in the next county. If I don't check in by morning, the police come here, and they won't be from Gray Ridge. Well, and it was a bluff. The library didn't have high-speed internet, and Elias hadn't sent anything, but in the smoke and fire, it sounded like the gospel truth." The sheriff looked at Silas, then at the fire, then at the solid, unshakable man standing in front of him with a war dog at his side. He lowered his head. "Get out of here, Thorne. Take your dog and get off this land." "No," Elias said. "You're going to stay right here while we leave." "And Silas? If I see a single headlight behind me, the upload goes live early." Elias whistled. Ace released Silas and backed toward Elias, never taking his eyes off the men. They walked into the darkness, the red glow of the fire fading behind them. Elias Thorne didn't go to Little Rock. He went to the one person he knew he could trust. He showed up at the back door of Martha Gale's diner at 4 in the morning. Martha, a woman who had seen everything and judged nothing, didn't ask questions. She let him in, cleaned the wound on his head, and gave Ace a bowl of steak scraps. "My grandfather wasn't a thief, Martha," Elias said as he sat at a back booth, the satchel open in front of him. "I know," Martha said quietly. "My mother used to say Victor Thorne was the only man in this county with a spine. That's why they hated him." The satchel contained the original documents of the 1945 naval fraud. But it contained something else, a series of deeds for small parcels of land all over the Ozarks, bought in trust names. Victor Thorne had used the money he'd recovered from the corrupt officers to buy land for the families of the men who had died under his command. He hadn't been a Wesselo who ran. He had been a guardian. The Thorne plot wasn't the dead plot, Elias realized. It was the anchor. Over the next month, the truth came out, not as a scandal, but as a slow, quiet reckoning. The federal investigators Elias eventually contacted didn't find gold, but they found enough evidence to break the hold the old families had on Gray Ridge. The sheriff resigned. Silas Pike moved away. Elias didn't sell the land. He moved into the largest of the cabins on the 12-acre riverfront property his grandfather had bought in secret. He spent the winter clearing the brush, repairing the roofs, and building a place where men like him, men who carried the weight of the deep, could find some air. He called it the Anchor. One evening, as the first signs of spring began to show in the buds of the sycamore trees, Elias sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Ace was lying at his feet, his muzzle gray but his eyes bright. A truck pulled up the gravel drive. A young man got out, a former Marine. Elias had met at a VA clinic in the city. The kid looked lost, his eyes darting toward the trees. "You Thorne?" the kid asked. Elias stood up. "I am. This is Ace." The kid looked at the river, then at the solid, quiet cabins. I heard a man can get some sleep here." Elias smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. "The river's quiet, and the dog's a good listener. Come on in." As they walked toward the cabin, Elias looked back at the woods. He thought about his grandfather, about the steel latch under the oak, and about the long, dark journey it took to get here. War takes pieces of you. The ocean tries to crush you. But if you have a good dog and a place to stand, you can always find your way back to the surface. If you believe that every veteran deserves a place like the Anchor, type yes in the comments. And tell us, who is the ace in your life? The one who kept you digging when the world told you to give up. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, honor, and the secrets that bring us home. Because some things are worth more than gold. Some things are worth the truth. The rain began to fall softly, a warm spring rain that smelled of new life. Inside the cabin, a fire was crackling. Ace curled up by the hearth, finally at peace. Elias Thorne picked up a hammer and got back to work. He wasn't a diver anymore. He was a builder, and for the first time in his life, he was home.